Well, I think I should probably sit over there. Where would be the best place for me to sit? Here? Yeah. Okay, I'll sit here. Ooh. Right, good morning. This is my last lecture in Pisa and my last day in Pisa, which is a great regret to me as I love being here. But we leave this afternoon. Well, what I've tried to do in these lectures is to set Keynes's life in a unity, starting with his earliest ideas, which were philosophical, and then showing how they worked through his economics to his visionary vision of the future, which is what this lecture is about. And I want to relate it. I mean, I think it relates very directly to those visions of the good life, which he had as a young man. As I think I said in my first lecture, he was very influenced by G. Moore's Principia Ethica, which was his theology substitute, and in which Moore said good is an intuitively seen property of things, and the good life is one in which you have a maximum engagement with things which are good in themselves, and a good state of affairs is one which has a maximum of objects which have this property good. And remember, you perceived it intuitively, just like I see that Alessio's pullover is blue and not green, so I perceive that something is good and not bad. I mean, that was the idea of the whole thing. So, and then his economics is really an attempt to bring about in the quickest possible time the good life and the good states of mind, and all his he says in the essay I'm going to discuss this morning, he says, I hope that soon economists will become as useful as dentists. So that was his ambition for economists, to become as useful as dentists, because then at that point, they'll just be there for the odd repair, and they won't dominate the way we think about things, because the economic problem will not be dominant any longer. So I want to start, though, by placing Keynes in the history of ideas of the good life, because he doesn't just come at it from nowhere. There was always this dream of beyond the present, something beautiful and good in the future. And where does it come from? I mean, all civilizations have this mythology that of utopia, beyond the toils and troubles and ugliness and messiness of this world, stretches something perfect. Most of the mythologies we know set these perfect societies at the dawn of history, at the beginning, not at the end, but at the beginning. And then actual life was a sort of fall from this state of perfection. But it may be regained. And obviously we have the myth of Genesis, and the Garden of Eden is the main Christian version of that myth. But we find it in Indian mythology and in Chinese mythology, always the golden age, and then the fall, and then the recovery eventually, with luck. Where does it? Why do we think this way? Well, the Christian answer is that we're made in God's likeness and carry the image of his perfection in our head, you see. I mean, that's the way, I think that's the way Christians would explain it. Well, of course, secularists don't believe any of that nonsense. They don't believe we carry the image of God in our heads. They believe we create these things ourselves, just because, I mean, I think for someone like Daniel Dennett, primitive man, primitive people see the world full of great powers which they can't understand, and so they make gods out of them. The gods don't exist. They don't actually have an existence to which we're linked in some way. We just invent them. They're creations of our mind. But then we move on to monotheism. And in monotheism, the world is emptied of gods. There's only one God, and that God isn't part of nature. He's prior to nature. And therefore, there is some perfection there in that God, which is absent from the world. And so we try to regain it in some way. Well, all this is part of the tradition. Keynes, you see, was brought very much in up in a religious, not in a religious household. It was religious in a conventional sense, but from a believing generation. All these mythologies and biblical stories were part of his childhood, and he used them in his own life, his own work. He was constantly using religious phrases of theological significance. And we can see he uses those in this essay on economic possibilities for our grandchildren, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Okay, you have the dream of perfection. You also, in early thought, you have perfect cities being imagined. Such a city was Plato's perfect city in the Republic. Then you can't create these perfect cities, and for a long time, people's ideas of ideal ways of life, utopias, were purely fanciful. They were purely imagined. Of course, they maybe inspired certain ideas, but you couldn't create them. And then you come to machines, and suddenly machines seem to open the road to feasible utopias because they reduce the amount of necessary work. They seem to create areas of freedom for people. They release the imagination from necessary toil. And suddenly it seems possible to create a utopia on this earth. But the model of that utopia is still being set by the original dreams of original states of perfection which we've left. So you can easily see how machinery might be mobilized to recreate paradise. And that's exactly the way Keynes saw it. The machines would enable paradise to be restored by removing the need to work for your living. Well, now I come a bit nearer to this, and I start with Keynes himself. His ideal society, he said, was, I'm quoting, lay on the extreme left of celestial space. By this, he meant that it would be post-capitalistic. Karl Marx also saw a realm of freedom stretching beyond the realm of necessity. However, Keynes's route to getting there was very different from Marx's. And the core of their difference, I've suggested, lies in their different views of historical dynamics. For Marx, the plot of history was given by the class struggle between owners and workers. For Keynes, it was the struggle between creditors and debtors, the moneylender and the entrepreneur. For most periods of history, in Keynes's view, it was the creditor who had held sway. That's why economic progress had been so slow and fitful. It was the abolition of usury, not the abolition of capitalism, that would open the way to his utopia. To imagine a future beyond capitalism, well, that requires some initial definition of what one thinks capitalism is. Capitalism is a word actually coined by the enemies of capitalism. Capitalists themselves never call themselves capitalists. They call themselves entrepreneurs, or they believe in free enterprise, or whatever it is, but they don't use the word capitalism. Capitalism was used, I think, in the 19th century by enemies of the new industrial system, but it's come into more general use. So as neutrally as possible, here are three definitions of capitalism which are worth considering. I don't think they're exhaustive, but they're the only ones I could think of at the time. First of all, following Karl Polanyi. Capitalism means that you have competitive markets in all the factors of production. All the factors of production are now subject to market exchange. Land, capital, labor. Before then, there were restrictions. The markets really were only confined to goods, more or less, and all the other factors were fixed in customary relationships, not subject to market exchange. It's the marketization of the factors of production that constitutes the essence of capitalism, according to Karl Polanyi. For Karl Marx, capitalism is defined by the ownership by a single class of capitalists of the tools of production. A single class owns the tools of production, no one else does. That's the pure essence of capitalism. And this, Marx argued, came about for the first time in history. The tools of production had always been more widely owned in the past. There were lots of small farms, there were lots of small businesses, they were widely spread. And here you have a situation where all the tools of production really are concentrated. It's a model, of course, it's a model. And it didn't even correspond to very much reality of the 19th century. We have to ask ourselves whether it corresponds more to the reality of present day life than it did in the 19th century. But that was the Marxist model. And then there was the third model of capitalism, which was the Weberian model, Max Weber. And there, capitalism is what he calls the expression of a spirit of worldly asceticism created by Puritanism. It's a new spirit. It's a spirit. It's not an institution, it's a spirit. The institutions are secondary. Maybe they give expression to the spirit, a concrete form to the spirit, but the spirit is important. And that enters history for the first time in the 16th and 17th century with Calvinism. I mean, that was the essence of the Weberian interpretation of capitalism. Now, Keynes is closest to the Weberian conception, his idea of capitalism. Capitalism was a psychological condition marked by what he called love of money. But whereas Weber regarded the Puritan spirit as noble and, ennobling, even heroic, Keynes came to see it as pathological, though a necessary pathology for getting to your bliss later on. Keynes, we must remember, was a contemporary of Freud. And there's a chapter in the Treatise on Money called Ori Sacra Fames, the hunger for gold, which is very Freudian. And basically, in that, and it explains, hoarding. I've talked about hoarding, constipation. It's all there, I mean, the hoarding instinct is the expression of an anal retentive personality in Freudian terms. And that's the metaphor Keynes uses in the Treatise on Money to explain this particular spirit of capitalism. So he plays around with this idea. Now, in the conception of capitalism, if you think of capitalism simply as an institution for the efficient production of goods and services, there's no reason why capitalism should ever end. In fact, there's no conception of the end of capitalism in economics. It doesn't exist. I mean, you have efficient. You have, on the one hand, you have increases in efficiency, which are due to technology and stuff like that, and on the other hand, you have insatiability. So the preferences of people are taken as given, and they choose, and they get more and more pleasure out of increments to their wealth and their goods. And so why should it ever end? Of course, you have the diminishing marginal utility of money, but that only applies to a particular line of goods. I mean, you might get fed up with each sweater that Alessio buys might give him less pleasure than the previous sweater. And by the time he has 100 blue pullovers, he may not want to have any more. He may be exhausted with that. But then they're yellow pullovers, and then they're green pullovers, and then they're things that aren't quite pullovers, but they're trousers. I mean, the whole marginal utility, diminishing marginal utility, can be postponed forever and ever by new gadgets of one kind or another. New things that are also advertised, and the more relentless the advertisements, the more you want things. So you go on consuming forever and ever without any loss in the satisfaction of what you're buying. So in that sense, until you reach maybe some point of ultimate limit to the natural resources of the planet, which of course is quite a serious consideration, but economics hasn't yet focused on, there's no reason why capitalism should ever end. Now, of course, in Marx, there is a reason why capitalism should end, because it's exploitative. That gives rise to revolt of the working class, and there's an overthrow of the system. So there is an end of capitalism in Marx. There's no end of capitalism, what we call capitalism, in orthodox economics that I can find. But maybe, economists themselves may have different views. They may have ethical conceptions and one sort, but not in economics do you find it. That's just private individuals. The point about Keynes is his economics and his ethics were integrally connected to each other. So you have a utopia in Marx, but what is the utopia in Marx? Of course, Marx is very unclear about what it is. The means of production would be collectively owned. That's obviously true. The administration of things would replace the government of people. That's also true. The division of labor wouldn't be there any longer because, I mean, you no longer need it. Goods would be distributed according to need and not according to for profit. Accumulation of capital would stop, and everyone would be free to pursue their own interests and pleasures and passions fully. But there, as far as I can tell, there isn't in Marx a substantive, an idea of substantive goodness, which will replace. I don't know what his future would actually look like, and I don't think he did. And I think, well, I don't think you can find it very easy. Engels had a bit more to say on it, but I don't think in Marx. So, what would a communist utopia look like? Well, you have to go back really to St. Thomas More and Utopia, his famous book Utopia in 1517, long before Marx, of course. And what More's social ideal was rooted in was monasticism. Its vision was that of a reformed Christianity. And that stood against the corruption of the actual world, and especially the corruption of the Catholic Church. You have this society, the society of his day in Elizabethan in England, in which on the one hand you have newly rich merchants wallowing in luxury and immorality, and on the other hand, a large and growing number of paupers. And so More thinks, wouldn't it be better if to provide everyone with some means of livelihood so that nobody is under the frightful necessity of becoming first a thief and then a corpse? So it's against that background, which, you know, is not so different from the way Marx described industrial England of his day, the pauperization of more and more people, and of course the very rich and this mass of poor people. So against that background, More projected a utopia in which everyone would be sufficiently secured of necessities by a central allocation system, which provide everyone with food, clothing, housing, education, and medical treatment. Hours of work, because this was more efficient, would be shortened, opening up time for prayer and contemplation. Well, that's similar to Keynes in Oxford, Cambridge, I mean. Prayer, philosophical contemplation, and thinking. It is secular versions of exactly this, which were promised by More. State functions were really to be reduced to a minimum. There would be some police still in More's utopia, but very minimal function, because everyone would be so happy with all their wants provided for that no one would have any incentive to crime. And I quote, public hospitals, plentiful common meals, relative freedom of movement would ensure widespread content. And if you set up this system, you could easily, I quote, escape the disasters, devastations, overthrows, and other calamities of war if they only adapt themselves exactly to the pattern of the utopian commonwealth. Well, you can understand the appeal of this. Add machinery to More's social system, and a communist utopia becomes feasible. There was no way of shortening hours of work and reducing the burden of necessity in More's 16th century imagination. It didn't exist. It became feasible later on. But of course, there are certain dystopian elements which we see in More, which I think become apparent whenever we look into the utopias that thinkers created. For example, everyone lives in identical houses. So that prefigures all these prefabricated Soviet cities, doesn't it? Leisure is made considerably less attractive by compulsory attendance at lectures. Because people have to be suitably indoctrinated into the morality of the society. So and you know, there's sort of some surveillance system everywhere. Everyone knows roughly what everyone else is doing. So it's very easy to see how this idea of utopia can readily turn into an idea of dystopia, a reality of dystopia, in fact, with the best intentions. You have to make sure that everyone does the right thing, because otherwise they fuck up your utopia, you see. So everything then has to be organized and surveyed. Now, Keynes's Utopia. Short essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, 1930, written in the depth of the Depression. While working out his cures for the great slump, Keynes also drew attention to a different kind of unemployment, not demand-deficient unemployment, but what he called technological unemployment. And where is my, that's the plan of the lecture. I should have put up the slide earlier. Here, this is what he says. We're being afflicted with a new disease of which some readers may not have heard the name, but they'll hear a great deal in the years to come, namely technological unemployment. This means unemployment due to our discovery of means of economizing the use of labor, outrunning the pace at which we can find new uses for labor. But this is only a temporary phase of maladjustment. All this means in the long run is that mankind is solving its economic problem. So their machinery comes in, right? Straight away. So extrapolating from, let's say, 2% growth per head, per capita over the previous 50 or 70 years, Keynes estimates that the real incomes of people over the period by his grandchildren's time would have increased by maybe between 4 times and 8 times. They'd be 8 times wealthier. And then abstracting from assuming no important wars and no important increase in population, the economic problem may be solved, I'm quoting him, or at least within sight of solution, within 100 years' time. But, yes, and then what happens in 100 years? For many ages to come, the old Adam will be so strong in us that everybody will need to do some work if he's to be contented. We shall do more things for ourselves than is usual with the rich today, only too glad to have small duties and tasks and routines. But beyond this, we shall endeavor, this is a very nice phrase, to spread bread thin on the butter. Not spread the butter thin on the bread, but spread the bread thin on the butter. The butter is in abundance, and the bread you don't have to have so much bread to earn that amount of butter. Spread the bread thin on the butter to make what work there is still to be done to be as widely shared as possible. 3-hour shifts or a 15-hour week may put off the problem for a great while. For 3 hours a day is quite enough to satisfy the old Adam in us. Adam. Theological reference is explicit there. Machines would do most of our work for us, making possible a return to paradise. And so that not prediction exactly, but expectation or idea of the future was rooted in the very old idea that once the material needs of humanity had been met, a space would be opened up for the good life. Efficiency in production wasn't a good in itself, but a means to the good, and only insofar as it produced the good. Keynes didn't say, of course, that individuals freed up from work would always choose to lead the good life, but he said the possibility for the first time was open to them, and that was never true before in human history, except for a small minority of aristocrats or people of great wealth who said they hadn't set a very good example, which they should have done in leading a good life. But the possibility Cambridge philosophers would set a much better example than the old aristocracy. But there it was. It was opened up. Now, and so what this would produce would be a profound change in human nature. When the accumulation of wealth is no longer of high social importance. This is a good passage because the link with Freud is very, very clearly brought out here. Many of the pseudo-moral principles which have had ridden us for 200 years, by which we've exalted some of the most distasteful of human qualities into the position of the highest virtues, we shall be able to afford to dare assess the money motive at its true value. The love of money as a possession, as distinguished from the love of money as a means to the enjoyment and realities of life, will be recognized for what it is, a somewhat disgusting morbidity, one of those semi-criminal, semi-pathological propensities which one hands over with a shudder to specialists in mental disease. All kinds of social customs and economic practices, which we now maintain at all costs because they're tremendously useful in promoting the accumulation of capital, we shall then at last be free to discard because we no longer need to accumulate capital. So that's it. I mean, that's how he sees his utopia developing out of the increasing abundance of capital. You will be able to, because of it, you'll be able to discard the love of money or avarice. It's a very, very different idea, isn't it, from just, the kind of Adam Smith's idea. It's very different from Adam Smith's idea. I mean, Adam Smith thinks of self-interest as basically benevolence. If it was disciplined by markets, of course, basically benevolent. But here, love of money, it's vicious, it's horrible, but it's necessary because it's out of this evil that the good will eventually come. But once the good is there or has been brought about, you'll be able to dispense with that. It's not natural. It enters human affairs as a social fact at a given time, as in Weber's Puritan character. It arises. It had always been condemned by moralists, the love of money. All through history, love of money had been condemned. Now, suddenly, love of money becomes good. But that's only because people understand that through love of money, you can overcome the economic problem. Once the economic problem is overcome, everyone will then come to believe, recognize the viciousness of this avaricious idea of always having more and more money and more and more money and more profit without end. So this was how Keynes thought the psychological revolution would come about, through capital abundance. And then, so once you have this new character created, look at this. I see us free, therefore, to return to some of the most sure and certain principles of religion and traditional virtue. That avarice is a vice, that the exaction of usury is a misdemeanor, and that love of money is detestable. That those walk most truly in the paths of virtue and sane wisdom who take least thought of the morrow. Precautionary motives, least thought of the morrow. We shall once more value ends above means and prefer the good to the useful. We shall honor those who can teach us how to pluck the hour and the day virtuously and well. The delightful people who are capable of taking direct enjoyment in things, the lilies of the field who toil not, neither do they spin, but beware, the time for all this is not yet. For at least another 100 years, we must pretend to ourselves and to others that fair is foul and foul is fair. From Macbeth, of course. For foul is useful and fair is not. Avarice and usury and precaution must be our gods for a little longer still, for only they can lead us out of the tunnel of necessity into daylight. So that is Keynes's justification for capitalism. Only these distasteful qualities set free, set loose by the capitalist system can bring us to the utopia that awaits by giving us sufficient abundance to be able to choose our futures freely. Of course, socialists didn't like that. And there were a lot of criticism of Keynes, I mean, from people, at the time who said he simply justified every capitalist practice, however horrible, because he said it's essential to get us quickly to the promised land. And you must reform capitalism. You mustn't just accept it. And Keynes, well, he did have a particular reform of capitalism, which I will come to, and I've already broached on. So he thought that you'll get to this promised land in about 100 years. This was the economic possibilities for our grandchildren. This essay was written in 1930, and we're 93 years later on. Do we see it? We should be there. We should be at the dawn of the new heaven now. And so he becomes more schematic about this in the Second World War. He says there'll be three phases we can look to. He wrote an essay called Long-Term Problem of Full Employment. Phase one, which he thought would last 10 years, would be a phase of reconstruction and really a continuation of the war economy, in which consumption had to be repressed. And in order to create resources, not for war anymore, but for reconstruction of damaged war, housing and so on. So you needed a heavy investment program, restricted consumption, in a war economy transiting to peace. That was his idea of the first stage. In the second phase, which he thought would last 5 to 10 years, there would be a rough equilibrium between saving and investment without rationing or other controls on consumption, and with the state active in speeding up and slowing down, regulating the rate of investment. So meanwhile, we're 25 years on, and we're in the Keynesian full employment era, so to speak. And then in phase three, investment demand would become so saturated that it would fall below people's customary saving as society grew wealthier, and therefore you couldn't maintain full employment without the state having to embark on wasteful and unnecessary programs, which are wasteful just to keep up. He thought this would be then the situation in 25 years' time, and then you would have a choice. Your policy should switch to encouraging consumption in order to reduce the marginal propensity to save, and working shorter hours, having shorter hours of work, and he said more frequent holidays. So these were the preparations you'd be making for as you approach the frontier of abundance. And eventually, when you pass the frontier, depreciation funds would be able to provide almost all the gross investment which was needed. And that then would be the age of the euthanasia of the rentier, since there'll be no demand for new capital. Therefore, there'll be no rents from the ownership of capital any longer. And that was, that vision of the euthanasia of the rentier, which we talked about yesterday, is there, of course, in economic possibilities for our grandchildren, because once societies were over what he called the hump, of scarcity, all the economic dentistry which Keynes was engaged in for most of his active life would become irrelevant, and it wouldn't be needed any longer. And the heaven opened up by More's Principia Ethica would be established on Earth. And he was very bullish about this in 1945. Here's a letter he wrote to, interesting, I think, to T.S. Eliot. And here he's talking about full employment policy is only one particular application of an intellectual theorem. You can produce the result just as well by consuming more or working less. Personally, I regard the investment policy as first aid. Isn't that interesting? First aid only. The whole of the Keynesian counter-cyclical and investment policy, that's first aid. It's not really, it's not at the heart of what he thinks the policy should be. In the United States, it will almost certainly not do the trick. In other words, what won't do the trick in the United States? What is the trick? The trick is to maintain full employment when there's already a sufficient abundance of capital. He thinks America's already in the situation where it could afford to work less. Less work is the ultimate solution. How you mix up the three ingredients of a cure is a matter of taste and experience, of morals and knowledge. It's very complicated, the ideas here, and I haven't time to go into them all, but you can see the way his mind was working. Well, so obstacles on the road, which is my final part of the lecture. Well, you know, his prophecies were only partly right, weren't they? Since 1930, technological progress has lifted average real income per head in rich countries by roughly 5 times. Keynes thought it would be between 4 and 8 times. I think it's been roughly 5 times. But average weekly hours of full-time work in rich countries have not fallen by nearly as much as Keynes thought, by about 20%. Since 1930, but not to 15 hours a week, which would mean cutting them by more than half. From average hours of work in 1930 would be 50 to 60 hours. Now we're talking 35, 40 hours. This is full-time work. So nothing like 15 hours. So what did Keynes get wrong? Well, I think he got, you can talk about what he got, but I think there are 3 things worth noticing. First of all, he ignored the distinction between needs and wants, leading him to neglect the possibility that insatiability might corrupt our pure Adam. So Adam would just become a sort of kind of, not a lover of the good and the beautiful, but simply a slave to junk. I mean, I think he ignored that. I think he understood that would be a problem, but he thought it wouldn't be a very important problem. Insatiability, natural and deliberately created, is what keeps machines in business. By ensuring that the material requisites of happiness remain permanently scarce. So our machines, instead of creating the abundance which Keynes thought they would, are a mechanism for creating scarcity by constantly manufacturing new ones. I'm talking not just the machinery. I mean, obviously the technology pure makes this possible, but also the whole of the machinery of advertising, manipulation of wants, and that kind of stuff. That's all part of the machinery, which Keynes thought would cure the problem. Secondly, I think another mistake Keynes made was he treated work purely as a cost, or as economists would call it, a disutility, and whereas it is both a curse and the condition of a meaningful life. See, the economics also is theological. Basically, it's all theology, isn't it? I mean, a disutility is God's curse. And that's when he expelled people from the Garden of Eden. He said, you shall work by the sweat of your brow and toil in the fields until, you know, and also another disutility is childbirth. Childbirth shall be painful. So work is associated with pain, and the economists simply take this over and treat work as a disutility, whereas in fact, it's, you know, people actually get a lot of satisfaction out of work. Not all work by any means, but a lot of work. It's effortful, but it gives a lot of satisfaction. It gives to life what the Greeks called eudaimonia. You know, a feeling that you're leading a good life, life that's of service to your fellows, that gives some, you know, allows you to exercise your own abilities, and which actually produces beautiful objects in some cases, especially the kind of work associated with craftsmanship. And the third thing Keynes ignored, and this is where socialists would obviously, or people on the left would obviously make a big criticism, was he ignored the question of distribution and therefore the question of power. He implicitly assumed that the gains from efficiency would go to everyone, not just the few. But there's no automatic mechanism to ensure this. And since the ascendancy of neoliberal economics in the 1980s and since the last 40 years, the social mechanism for securing real wage growth in line with improvements in productivity have simply gone into reverse. While some people have reduced their hours of work because they can afford to, many others are compelled to work longer hours than they want to in a desperate effort to hold on to what they already have. For this reason, the economic future facing our grandchildren is actually less rosy than, I think, than those facing Keynes's grandchildren. Well, so we come to this, and then another problem in Keynes's essay, and that is he was curiously blind to the possibility that the machines which would free us from work might also colonize our lives. In retrospect, the entanglement of actual machines with ideas about how to organize the machinery of living seems inevitable. I mean, you know, he seemed to believe that the machines would stop at the doors of the factory or the office. And, you know, they'd automate those things and then free up time free from machines, so to speak, in order to organize the rest of our lives. And yet, that can't be. Why should machinery stop at the door of the office? What about all the other machinery? The machinery of surveillance, for example. And we now know that this is spreading the whole time. So we have artificial intelligence, we have voice recognition system, we have face recognition system. Everything we do is now serviced by machines, or more and more of what we do is now serviced by machines. And that, of course, makes us slaves to machines rather than masters of machines. Of course, we say we are masters. We can click off whenever we want to. But Keynes seemed blind to the invasion, the possibility of the invasion by machinery, and particularly, he lived before the age of computerization, to the possibility of colonization of the whole of life, rather than just the work bit of life. And that sort of has been happening. And it's, curiously enough, it's in his classic, The Road to Serfdom, that Hayek warned against exactly this possibility in these words: the uncritical transfer to the problems of society of the habits of thought of the natural scientist and the engineer. And as soon as you start thinking of machinery as a solution to various problems of life, why stop there? It was then, society itself becomes an engineering problem. And it is not just work that becomes an engineering problem, it's society itself that becomes an engineering problem. You then find that Keynes's realm of freedom turns into Weber's iron cage of bondage. And that's the issue, isn't it, today? Is artificial intelligence an agent of utopia or dystopia? I think Giovanni Dossi has just written a paper on this, in which you have these either dystopian possibilities looming up, or the Keynesian liberating possibilities. And I think it's dystopia. What's really interesting now, how is all the fiction and films are dystopian. There's no utopian film or fiction dealing with the future that is not dystopian. Everyone. And that wasn't true in the 19th century. You have utopian fiction writers. I mean, Moore's an early example, but H.G. Wells, all his books are very utopian. I mean, machines are going to transform everything. They're going to make us all better. And on the whole, the utopian current, or rather the optimistic current, is still carried by business leaders, by economists, by all the, but not any longer by the real scientists. That is, the physicists and chemists and biologists. They're all dystopian now. They say this is runaway, this is rogue, this is Frankenstein. So I think that's a good point at which to end Keynes's economic possibilities for our grandchildren, because we are his grandchildren, and we also have our own grandchildren, or at least I do, and you will have. Thank you.
During the lecture, I felt a hard discontent against the way in which the concept of welfare is used. The concept of welfare that is used in the current state of the art in economics. And I was thinking about what these exercises of cost and benefit analysis for taking decisions in the political science. For example, specifically, I was thinking about some cost-benefit analysis I've been exposed to in the analysis of the COVID-19 pandemic, where economists try to attach a value to the life of men. Or another case is the Ukraine war, and again, where I don't think actually that we can perform such kind of exercises, which is totally at the opposite, at the extreme of Keynes' ideas of good, the concept of good, and this welfare is, not the end, is a myth, and possibly maybe another difference is that this utilitarian concept is also subjective, attached to utility, against something that is more real. But so then what are the implications? How should we take this analysis as a piece of of information to take more consciously, to use more consciously in social decision, or Keynes will totally discard this kind of analysis?
No, I think he would regard it as a means, wouldn't he? I mean, against anything that is desired or that you can plausibly say will improve welfare in material terms, you can also always ask, is it good? In other words, I mean, this is exactly what Moore called the naturalistic fallacy, with identifying what is good with what is wanted. So people want better health, right? And there may be a trade-offs, all kinds of trade-offs connected with longer life and or better health and things like that. You can always ask, is it good to have a longer life? Why is it good? People want it. People want all sorts of things, but is it good? He would always say all cost-benefit analyses, all utilitarian calculations have to be related to some substantive morality. Substantive, that is a notion of what is good, which we recognize. And of course, you have an additional problem with utilitarian cost-benefit analysis, that you only have a very limited insight into the future. You can't measure the future as it gets more and more futuristic, because you don't have any numerical probabilities concerning the consequences of your actions. So these methods of measuring welfare have their place, but always in the light of the ultimate or basic question, what is good? And there's no one-to-one correlation between GDP and goodness. It's obviously true there isn't, and everyone recognizes it. But as soon as they try to expand the menu of orthodox welfare economics into ideas of well-being, you immediately have to have proxies, and of those proxies, you always have to ask, are they good? I mean, for example, one proxy would be education, years in education. You can measure that, and you can measure progress by years in primary school, years in university. Is it good that people should have more years in school? You might say, well, it's obviously good, they'll be more educated and so on. But you always then put that, then you tick that, that's fine. It's good that that should be the case, but as a means to a good, because what you get at the end of the result is educated people, therefore people who have more choice about how to live their lives. So in that sense, you always, but you can't assume it. You can't assume it. You've always got to have it at the back of your mind. If you're a Christian, or if you're a Buddhist, or if you're a Confucian, you always have that framework there anyway. But if you're a secularist West European, it's not so obvious. That's why, as I said in my lectures, Keynes was always looking for a theology substitute. And he found it in this set of ideas of ethics, which was his religion. I'm not saying it can be everyone's religion, but nevertheless, he saw the need for a religion. He says so time and again. Once we get the economic problem, basic economic problem out of the way, we can return to the discussions of religion, the religious idea of what good life is. But, that's where he left it. Now we talk about equipping machines, artificial intelligences, with moral principles before they sort of start destroying us. That's very much the idea of the Oxford transhumanists. But what are these moral principles? How do we agree on them? And they say at the end, they reach this dead end. Unfortunately, it's very, very hard, they say, to find agreement on the appropriate moral principles with which we should equip our AIs before they actually start destroying us.
very short because it's the fact that AIDS, the way of Freud is, but I was thinking, I mean, his prediction, economic possibilities, achievements, area achievements, depend very much on saturation of demand, right? Is that the demand saturates. And yes, but I mean, if demand saturates or not depends on our needs and wants, right? And it seems to me that this part is not really explored. It's as maybe so maybe other economy, even I mean the Austrian tradition, economists and not only economists were more aware of the problem of needs and wants as an important thing.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that at least in this I say, is not really mentioned, just say demand must saturate. A little bit like demand saturates like following a sort of Engel's law, like right, that demand for food, like Ernst Engel was the statistician, I mean,
Yeah.
in the 20th century, saying yes, must saturate because yes, demand for nourishment has to diminish as income goes up. So it seems to me that this part is not really explored and is key to understand whether yes we can, I mean, work less in the future. So and yes, I mean, what I was asking to myself is maybe to answer this question we need psychology. I mean, it's not really the job of the economist alone to say what are needs and wants and whether these needs and wants can be. Is a more complex question which cannot be addressed by economists alone.
No, of course, economists can't do all the work, which is why we need interdisciplinary work. You're right. I mean, Keynes, he was aware of the distinction between needs and wants, but he parked it. You know, this was a 10-page jeu d'esprit. He doesn't deal with the whole history of, you know, needs and wants in this essay. He just says, look, we abstract. I understand wants may be insatiable because they're relative. And what you have, I want, I get envious of you. And, you know, Veblen was one of these economists who really did explore the relative nature of wants. And other economists have been aware of them. But of course, the other thing Keynes ignored, because it was only starting, was mass advertising. I mean, this was before you'd already got radio, but radio wasn't yet a very, very important electronic means of advertising, and it was before television. And so he never really got to live in a world in which you had advertising directed at you 24 hours of the day. Galbraith was already part of this world, and in his book, The Affluent Society, he understood this was the real problem. You know, and the idea of manipulated wants. See, economists are useless on advertising. They say advertising doesn't give you create any new wants. It simply makes you aware of compliments of one kind or another. So, you know, I mean, you use pens, so someone advertises some ink. I mean, and it simply just gives you more information about the wants you already have. It doesn't create any new ones. And I mean, I've read some of the stuff about this, and they're useless. It's just quite, yeah, of course, it's part of it, but it's only one part. It actually creates new wants. You know, I mean, and those fall into the category of relative wants. So you start with you have an iPhone, right? And then you have a new model of the iPhone, and then another model of the iPhone, and then even a more improved one. And why? Why do you want more improved one? Because someone else has an improved one, and you haven't got an improved one. And so you get this escalation in that way. And I think that goes on the whole time. And there's a very interesting book by Tibor Skidelsky called The Joyless Consumer, where you have a consumption-based civilization, but they don't get any pleasure out of it, really. Yes, and Engels' law and the hierarchy of wants by someone like Abraham Maslow. It's good, and you also get it in early marginalists. You get this kind of hierarchy of goods. I forget his name, Menger, yeah. It's all an important frame for all this, but of course it's very simple. The fact is that you can get more and more variety of food. You don't just sort of, have some vegetables and then you move on to cigarettes and then you move on to alcohol. I mean, it doesn't work quite in that sort of way. Your tastes are expanding at each level of your satisfaction of wants. So that's actually the way insatiability works. So I've become a little more suspicious of hierarchies of this kind. Nevertheless, you're right. Keynes simply said, let's ignore all that and just assume that in 100 years' time, everyone will have enough to eat, enough housing, and enough for simple pleasures of one kind or another, and then they'll be able to devote themselves to the higher life. I mean, it was that kind. The other thing about that essay, which I think is extremely important to know, but it's also a sign of where the intellectual elite was in England at the time, he delivered this first to some school children. And they were very clever school children. They were school children, sixth formers at a school called Winchester. And so they were 16 to 18-year-olds. They were the top intellectual level. He thought they'd understand all this. And they may have done, who knows? Thank you. Thank you for asking.
My question is related to the notion of how close was Keynes to the ideas of Ricardo about it? The second one is, was he really optimistic for the future of children for the society as a whole, or actually was really pessimistic like Ricardo principle of economics about the notion or the essence of the technology labor destruction. So that's my point.
Yeah.
Because reading Keynes, I see many points very similar to one of to those.
Yeah.
It's a evil society, and it's also is consequentially scheme of society and economics. Sure.
Well, that's a good question. And remember, I mean, I think that what I've been mainly talking about is, Keynes in history. So, of course, that's the history of economic thought as well. And these ideas, you find them in one form or another throughout the history of economic thought. In Ricardo, Principles of Economics, second edition, 1823 or 4 or 5, you have look up chapter 30. And he adds chapter 30, and it's on the question of machinery. He doesn't have it in his earlier edition, but by this time the Industrial Revolution has been making some progress. So he has the question of machinery. And of course, there he discusses the economic theories of the English handloom weavers, who were called the Luddites. And the Luddites went around smashing machines. They were these sort of great machine smashers. They said the machines are taking our jobs. And depriving us of our skills. What are we going to do? And so all the political economists said, these ignorant idiots, they don't understand the benefits that just lie ahead. And Ricardo said, no, of course they're right, from their own point of view. They're perfectly right. He said, no proposition of the Luddites is inconsistent with the laws of political economy. But then, of course, you see, he has his famous escape route, the long run and the short run. In the short run, it's true, they'll be wiped out, the handloom weavers. And there were at that time, there were about 300,000 of them in England. And they all disappeared. They moved their trades, or they went into pauper houses, and their children found jobs in the expanding economy elsewhere. But in the short run, they lost catastrophically. All their communities and everything else were simply destroyed. And Malthus said to Ricardo, hey, you just sort of can't ignore this. Economics can't ignore what happens in the short run. And Ricardo says, I turn my eyes to the ultimate consequences of things, not to their immediate effects. So there it is. There you get the debate. And of course, you have at this point, when you have Ricardo and the other form of Malthus together, with Ricardo and his theory of the diminishing marginal productivity of land, and Malthus in his law of fertility, together, you have economics known as the dismal science. There's simply no possibility of improvement when you put these two things together, except, the wages fund has to be controlled. The only possibility of improvement in that kind of class structure is to deprive landlords of their rents. And that enlarges the investment fund and the wages fund together. And so there you have some possibility of improvement, which is why all these political economists were very anti-landlord. They were very against the corn laws, against all the measures to protect the position of the landlord. So that was the small area of improvement that the early political economists offered. But, of course, there was emigration, which, two things falsified the law of diminishing marginal productivity of land. One was machinery, get more output per acre. The other was you got more acres. You just sent your surplus population off to America, where there was free land, you see, free, as they then thought of it. In fact, it was occupied by some primitive people, didn't really weigh with them at that time. So gradually then you overcame the Malthusian problem through and then also the growth of contraception was quite important. And economics became joyful again. But you're still within the parameters of welfare, not what you do with it when you've got into a more abundant condition. So you're right. I mean, all these lines of argument can be traced in the history of economic thought. Keynes, Ricardo, Keynes, Malthus, Keynes mercantilist, where he in chapter 23 of the General Theory. He says the mercantilists, when they identified wealth with the precious metals and wanted to import the precious metals at that time, why? To get down the rate of interest. You see, he sort of sees that mercantilists were after the same thing, or some of them, not all of them, but some of them were after exactly the same thing as he was, to get down the long run rate of interest. You have more money, rate of interest falls. So it's very important. What I'm really saying is it's very important for students of economics to study the history of economic ideas. And then you realize that, the latest wisdom is not the only wisdom. And some of the latest wisdom actually has roots in the past, which gives you a more capacious idea of the wisdom than simply building lean models can do for you. Are you coming this way or that way?
Again, and I would like to know if there are any links between the famous speech of President Roosevelt on the 11th January of 1944. So it was proposing a second Bill of Rights and Keynes' view of society.
Well, you must tell me, what did Roosevelt say on the 11th of January 1944?
I know the...
Well, I mean, I don't know everything.
No, because essentially he said that more or less there are some self-evident economic freedom that somewhat we should guarantee. And among these, so the employment, so the right to work, so an adequate income for food, shelter, recreation, freedom from unfair competition and monopolies, decent housing, social security, education.
Well, I think these sort of speeches and promises were being made quite often in 1944, and there was an British equivalent, which was the Employment White Paper of 1944, which committed the government to full employment, essentially. Said we will not allow in the future situation to develop like in the 1930s. So, and that was one of the messages that the Allied leaders wanted their peoples to learn or get as the war was drawing to its close. It was the Second World War equivalent of the pledge at the end of the First World War to create a land fit for heroes. The language was slightly, now the language, you could use the language of rights, which was more usual in America, or you could use another kind of language. Keynes's response to the Employment White Paper in 1944 was to say the commitment is worth all the rest. All the rest is sort of, kind of cosmetics, but the commitment is the important thing. Then you work out how you meet your commitment. The other scheme worked out in 1944, in the early 1940s in Britain, was the Beveridge Report. And he was wildly enthusiastic for the Beveridge Report. He raised questions of affordability. He raised questions which then later on became much more important about, against what are you really trying to ensure? And gradually the idea of social insurance grew, but the idea of social insurance in Beveridge was very important, and Keynes endorsed that. So the two things together gave rise to what in the 1960s flowered as Keynesian social democracy. I mean, that if you want to put a label on the political economy of Western countries in the post-war period, you'd call Keynesian social democracy is the label I use. Social insurance came late to America. I mean, a lot of those Roosevelt programs weren't actually carried out, but one commitment was made, which was the Act of Congress of 1946, which pledged the administration to maintain a high level of employment. And that was, in a way, the American definition. And you didn't know quite what high meant, but there was a quite considerable reliance on something known in American discussion of the time on a reliance on the automatic stabilizers. That, you know, and a lot of it wasn't discretionary, it was automatic. You know, as the economy went into downturn, you got automatic increase in social expenditure of one kind or another, which acted as stabilizer. But it didn't stabilize at full employment, it just stabilized. You know, it prevented really deep depressions developing, and it stopped runaway booms. There was this automatic stabilizer element. An automatic stabilizer becoming possible the larger the share of GDP represented by public spending. If the share is very, very small, let's say 5%, or 10%, as perhaps it was before the First World War, then no real automatic stabilizers are possible. Once it gets to 20%, 25%, 30%, you get substantial automatic stabilizers. And in a way, that was what also made it feasible. You didn't even need, you didn't even need, you know, a multiplier theory. That just worked automatically. The multiplier added a degree of refinement so that you could actually fine-tune it, or think you could fine-tune it more accurately. And so these were the elements of the mix. Have I answered? No, I haven't. Okay. Yeah. Wait, we ought to go, should we? Or have we got time? Would you like to ask a question? Yeah, okay. Of course.
Thank you very much, Robert, for your week. My question is about the concept of money, which starts from biographies, your books and talks. I always wonder who was the mostly true Keynes, the speculator, the one who went to Soviet Union with Lydia, thought that actually this communist had, in a way, I mean, he found some respect for the way in which the communists had a limited desire, crave for money. The Keynes that was against Rentier in the general theory. I mean, I was wondering what was the relation Keynes with the money making, especially in the financial sector, meaning making money from money. In the light also of, since this lecture is about visionary, what happened in the 70s, the expansion of the financial sector, a world that we are still living today that means imagine perhaps that.
Yeah, no. I mean, you know, you can't really, you can't actually you can't believe in, you know, complete consistency over a lifetime. People's characters change. You do things also when you're younger, which you then don't do when you're older, and your circumstances change. The experiences you have change your views. Keynes yes, he spent a lot of his early life in speculation. He was good. He enjoyed it. I mean, in the GT, general theory, he says, you know, the life of a speculator, most people don't speculate because it's intolerably boring for most people to always be on the telephone. Now it would be on the computer, to track the latest movement in this share price, buy here, sell there. I mean, I knew a lady who was doing that. Gus, do you remember that what was she called? Anyway, she was the mad speculator. Every second of the day, she was buying and selling, and I don't think she made any money. But I mean, you know, it was just a kind of madness. What? Yeah, gambling. There's some gambling instinct. I think that must be it. And he said, you know, for most people, they enjoy the odd gambler, but they don't become addicted to gambling. And he said, in the general theory, he said, you know, the affairs of a country are very, very badly managed when its financial allocation is a byproduct of the casino. Yeah. So he speculated. He was good at it. He thought he'd make a lot of money. He lost a lot of money. And why was he a speculator? He was trying also to get a fortune independent of his rather small university stipend, in order to help his friends as well, who were mainly artists, struggling artists, painters, and so on. He wanted actually to get some money in order to help them. And so he speculated, and he also wrote about speculation on foreign currencies. There are ethical issues in his early conduct. I mean, for example, Keynes makes a speech about the German debt in 1920s, early 20s, and there's a fall in the Deutschmark because his words by this time carry huge authority. He says Germans won't be able to pay their debt. Whoosh, the currency collapses. His father writes, I hope you did not have any position in German Marx when you made that speech. Yeah? Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, I don't know. Maybe he did have a position. I think there were much more relaxed rules about inside information, outside information. He was treasury, ex-treasury person. He knew at that point treasury set the bank rate. It wasn't the Bank of England. It was the treasury. Did he know when the bank rate was about to go up or go down? Well, anyway, all that is there in his early life. By the time of the general theory, he says speculation is not only a mug's game for the speculator, but it's ethically wrong. And he says the relationship between a person and their shares ought to be as that between a husband and wife. Now, again, you wouldn't use exactly that image today, because it was an idea of faithfulness, an ideal of faithfulness. And I think marriages were expected to produce more faithful behavior in 1930 than they are today. So, I mean, you know, the imagery changes, but the idea is exactly the same. You get married to your share, and it's a long-term commitment. And he said that's the only relationship that makes capitalist society possible. If it's all speculative, then of course the system collapses. And of course he uses in his liquidity preference theory, that's based on the speculative motive for holding money. So I'd say, in answer to your question, he's not completely consistent. He enjoyed it, I think. He enjoyed speculation. He came to the conclusion that he didn't actually, it wasn't a long-term route to making money, because there were these crashes along the way, and he made a lot of money and then he lost it. He lost 2 or 3 fortunes on speculation. He says speculating in currencies makes it impossible to actually have a stable system of international trade, although he understood hedging and everything else. And then he said, you marry your shares. Just as, you don't speculate in land, or you shouldn't, you don't speculate in shares. I can't hear you completely from there, I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing he foresaw was that there wouldn't be international mobility of capital after the war. There would always be the possibility in the system of capital controls. You'd always have enough knowledge of the inflows and outflows to be able to introduce a machinery of capital controls when you want to. In other words, you would not have a system which allowed money laundering of any kind. Now, that was defeated by what? Ideology or technology, or the two in combination. The ideology came first, obviously Thatcher's Big Bang and that sort of stuff, and then the technology, and then the counter technology. So that whole escalation of speculation was something that Keynes' system wouldn't have allowed. On the stock market, of course, there was very, very heavy marginal tax rates. So, I mean, things like the Tobin tax, distinguishing between short run and long run investments, they were implicit in the system of exchange controls or controls on stock markets that operated then in the 1950s and 60s. They made those distinctions. And apart from that, there were very high rates of taxation on profits and on income. So you had a system in which, as Keynes put it, the game can be played for lower stakes. You can get all the benefits of a capitalist system without having to play it for such high stakes, such high profit promises. And so that was completely contrary to the philosophy of the Laffer curve of the 1980s, where the lower the rate of taxation, the more activity you're generated, and therefore the faster the rate of growth and better the performance of the economy. And that he would have said that's total rubbish, and indeed it is rubbish. Who is it that works? Someone earning a lot of money would work less when her rate of tax went up by 1% or 2%, and say, oh, it's not worth working 50 hours a week when the marginal increase in my income is so small. Therefore, every increase in income tax is accompanied by a reduction in work effort. I mean, who believes that as a psychological fact? This guy, he's mad, Laffer. I mean, he was pretty mad. He kept tigers and sort of wild beasts in his house and all kinds of weird things. He's interesting, eccentric as an economist, but he was very, very, very influential at the time. But I think psychologically but it was ultra rational. You see, you could do a trade-off, a calculable trade-off between the rate of taxation and the level of work effort. I mean, that is straightforward economic logic, but it's much too precise to be a realistic account of human behavior or business behavior. I think we're at the end. We've come to the end of the. Yeah, you want more? Everything comes to an end. Yeah, yeah. Even Utopia comes to an end, unfortunately. I think that's one of the things I've learned. I've just been. I've just finished writing a book on utopias, and one of my conclusions is, you know, the nearer the view comes into sight, the stronger its dystopian elements become apparent. Right. Okay. I have to make sure it's correct. So for first year, PhD students in economics and no, because somehow we said yeah. I see it. You get it all from the road. Which way it's stay out of it. Well, did you later on the while it's
showing you the world is in some way or other there in society to sort time people are strong, savage. So there we are. They're all just speaking. Both now.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I think one of them. Yeah. You said I was. There's a third one. That's it. Here we are. Anyway, very good. That's very nice. Maybe it's back.
And enjoying the things to you know.
Probably the word. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Received. Yes, she said, and then. Oh, let's do that. Well, we have to go.
So we need to take the evidence to that from the back with see. Oh, and then okay. Wait. I don't think so. No. I didn't know. They say that they still proud. And this figure out this is 150 and more. You help them. Dixie that here. All the 50. No, we're not. Oh, yes, you are. All 50 there on Rufus and we moved and I thought, oh, that's what they're talking about. They will make it work. Right. Your office work that. No. All of this. Here we are, two multi. Forget. This. Food. Yeah. This is a food. Going to have one. That's food. The other proof is okay, now we've got how we try. Oops. Very good. Very much. Very boring. The other. What? The other not. The other not. This one is on an urban. It's my tax. So I didn't come from the tax. So you lost that. Now this goes to the relative
control. This one, no. Drop. Well, this is why we want to this. Look,
So,
this is this one. This one.
I know, right.
Yes, it is. It is. To
Yes, from in to B.
up, not from. You went from.
Yeah, right. That's right.
So I we love this.
And then we have another big one. Oh, great.
Oh,
Thank you.
what? This is your friend. This is. That's. Yes.
You don't have to fly from Rome to London.
But then you
Yeah, then we come.
see.
We addressed them to Alice. But yes, he's not the one. He gave me the name Mountain. Used to be our ones, but see. With it. Okay. Irish. Lee is to Gianmario. Manucci. Gianmario. Very good.
And it's evident. Those are why not? Okay, go on.
These are all, yeah.
Skidelsky and Ciclo. Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah.
Okay, so. Skidelsky.
I don't.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, my God. Ah. What's this?
Nice. Lovely.
Yes.
Oh, we haven't said electron.
The road.
Row. Flight.
So that. Road.
Hour. He's paid. Paid.
I mean, when they say travel, it's here. With it's direct, so I don't know how quite good in the record. Well,
and track as environment. And also, when they invited me to give a seminar, they paid for one travel from my hometown, visa, and visa to go.
So that's from this. With possible. Right.
Yes, train costs to road plus the flight back to road.
Yeah.
Even a reservation in Europe that you. Yes, I promise. No, what's the point of it?
This other, this is.
Now, again, have a company. Good.